Welcome to Chapter 7 in AI Evals for Everyone course. So in this one, we'll be diving deeper into production monitoring strategies. Essentially, we'll be talking about practical solutions for the four categories of core challenges that we discussed in the previous chapter about how the shift or the mindset change needs to happen when we are going from evaluation to production monitoring. So the first one we talked about is log filtering. Essentially, think of log filtering as the idea of finding key things that matter to you and surfacing that to you as a product developer and getting your attention to look at that. So it's kind of like a needle in the haystack problem where there's a lot of interactions that your product is actually doing with the customers. Majority of them could actually go correctly and harmless, but you need right checks in place to flag those things, and that is what we're talking about here. So because of this many interactions, we can think of adding log filtering in different contexts, right? For example, let's go back to the customer support product that we're building. Now we can have some priority based metrics where based on the business logic that you have, you can add in some checks to add more of those logs. For example, if you have a lot of enterprise customers where you want to extremely have high bar of the quality of responses, you can actually add more of those into your list of logs that are filtered and examined later, right? So that is one kind of filtering that you can actually use for these logs. And the second kind of filtering that you can use is signals or metrics based filtering. And these signals can be both explicit user signals or implicit user signals. For example, explicit user signals could be anybody giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or even like a written feedback. These are extremely high value signals, but at the same time, not very easy to get that out of customers. So we also kind of rely on implicit signals where user likes the response because they copy pasted something from your generation, or they immediately close the window and give a feedback, and so things like that. And the final criteria can be dynamic filtering, where as your application is evolving, you want to be able to configure what kind of logs that you want to look at in a more customizable way without having to redeploy your application. So this is where dynamic filtering comes into the picture, where say, for example, you pushed a new version of your product and then you want to, for the first like one day or something, or a week, identify log more of these entries, and as you gain more confidence, you can actually reduce the number of logs that are filtered and used for your offline analysis. So these are the kinds of filtering that you can use for understanding what kind of logs to actually look at. And to dive a bit more deeper into different kinds of signals, so you can think of signals as like conversation patterns, stemming from conversation patterns. And what we mean by that is, given a conversation, do you have like a right kind of signals where you can judge whether the interaction was like good for the user, or like there is some trouble that needs to be flagged. For example, if the conversation is like of unusual length, you better want to know what actually led to that long conversation, and then observe in your offline analysis. Also, if the user is repeating the question, most likely because the model is not giving the right answer, or like it's getting the wrong context and then misleading the user. So in those cases, you want to still know what is happening there. And there are also these user behavior patterns, where basically, if you think of ChatGPT, for example, if you generate some content with ChatGPT for like writing an email, but you go often and edit like many sentences in that, it's a clear indication that the user is not satisfied with the answer. So you would want to flag that for offline analysis so that you can understand what happened there and what is the final solution that the user used, so that you can use that as the ground truth. Now, there's also the idea of retry behavior. Like I could go like generate an image in a website, and I don't like that image, and I slightly change the prompt, generate it again, and change the prompt and generate it again. And this is a clear indication of user friction that we want to eliminate. So this is also something that can be appropriate to flag up. And there are also these abandonment patterns. For example, I generated something, but I didn't really like it. So I don't take any action, but I just like say quickly close my tab, or even just like go and open a new chat to start over. These kind of patterns are essential to understand these implicit feedback signals from the users that the users don't explicitly tell you, either by providing a feedback form or thumbs up, thumbs down kind of things. So the clear decision that you as a product builder should make is, what kind of signals in this huge spectrum do I need to actually gather to understand whether my application is like doing the right thing, and if there are any issues, they will get flagged correctly. Now, once you have these signals, we need to design metrics which are capable of catching these signals and flagging them back to the product developer, right? So these metrics can be of, like, as we discussed, in many shapes and sizes. But there are three fundamental criteria by which you need to decide whether a metric is worth including or not. The first one is impact, and the impact is a straightforward understanding of, like, whether this metric, or if I have this in my application when it's deployed to production, is it going to give me a high signal? And for example, if I have a metric that can actually capture like all of these four, and that would be amazing. Like, I would just have that metric as like a very key high impact metric there. And then the second one is actually reliability. If you have a metric, associating it with reliability is extremely important, because this is kind of flagging the anomalous use cases for you, right? So you need to make sure that this metric is both like reliable, in the sense that the false positives are like not as impactful, and the false negatives, which mostly are like even more worse, and needs to be reduced. So this is another key criteria in deciding whether like this kind of metric can be used in this. And the third, but like probably the most important of it, is also the cost. You can always have like this very strong reasoning models, large prompt kind of LLM judge metrics that you can use to actually gain a very good knowledge of like what kind of category of errors that the model is making, and whether this error is like rectifiable or not, and like things like that. But it becomes prohibitive to do this at a production scale for like hundreds of thousands or like even millions of interactions. So cost becomes a very clear factor, and especially if you cannot even rely on human judge and an LLM judge, and actually need to get a human review, then it becomes incredibly prohibitive. So cost is also a good factor to consider when you are adding these metrics. To summarize it even more, we can think of the metrics as a trade-off of the cost and impact, and we have these four quadrants that emerge. So on the top left, we have the must-have metrics, which are essentially low cost but have high impact. So what I mean by that is, like, these don't really require a lot of infrastructure spend or human cost, but then they actually give you like very strong signals on if your product is doing something wrong. So think of something like latency. If like your model's responses latency is increasing, then you would better want to know it much sooner than your customers reporting it through the bugs. Or even simple safety filters are essentially very valuable to make sure your product is sticking to its lane and not delivering harmful responses. And there's also this category of high impact but high cost metrics. And the way to think about them is, you have deployed your application, you have like a very extensive knowledge of what it's being currently used, but there are this category of errors which happen not so frequently, but you really need to understand that, okay, if I have a complex metric in place, I would actually be able to catch those quickly and then answer those. So those are the kind of category of metrics that go into the rightmost top quadrant, which is like a strategic investment, where you are thinking of long term on how do you bulletproof your application even further, and that is the kind of metrics you need to be thinking about. Cool. So let's discuss a third category, which was the offline and online evaluation. In most cases, that this is also duped as guardrails and improvement flywheel. And what we mean by that is, let's say your application has numerous behaviors that could actually go wrong, and each wrong is not the same type of wrong. What I mean by that is, some kind of behaviors need to be immediately flagged, or even better, like not even be displayed to the user and error out. And these kind of online metrics that we can come up with, which have this strong bar of what your product can say, those are guardrails. And these guardrails are essentially happening online or real time as the customer is engaging with your product. And this kind of strictly guarantee that your application is not doing something wrong in these particular categories. So those are like these real-time critical business metrics. Think of like safety evaluation filters, or like escalating to a human in case like some critical context is missing, or even thinking, if your customer support agent, again, if the customer needs a refund for some complex issue, you would rather escalate to a human rather than actually answer the question and then incorrectly, right? So these are the kind of guardrails. And in terms of offline improvement flywheel, these are also cases where your product is not doing the right thing, but it's not extremely important to stop them, but it's okay to go back and evaluate these cases offline and then build the a flywheel to understand if you can have a better evaluation metric in place to catch this in the later. So this is the difference of what someone means when they're using a guardrail versus an improvement flywheel where you're actually doing things offline and then coming back to it. So we talked about guardrails and distinction, but what are the kind of guardrails that you can actually commonly use when you're building an application? The first category is safety violations. And this comes in different form factors for different business products that you're building. Think of them as like video content monitoring or image monitoring, or even harmful content by doing string filtering and things like that. So that is one category of applications. And one is compliance failures. This could be any PII leakage kind of checks that you might add to the application. These need to be extremely carefully designed so that none of your company's principles are being violated by the product's responses. And there's also uncertainty detection that you can actually use, which, like, for example, we discussed this refunds use case, where if the model is uncertain and the use case seems important, then the product should actually escalate to the human rather than trying to come up with an uncertain answer or ask too many follow-up questions leading to user frustration. So there are categories of guardrails which are must and should for any application, and there are categories of guardrails which are nice to have in flagging or like ensuring customers experience with the product is like smooth. So these are the wide category of guardrails that you can think of when building your application. And the fourth category of production monitoring strategy we discussed in the last chapter was emerging issue discovery. So this is very common and very tricky to catch when you're actually building these applications, and becomes even more trickier as the product stays out there for longer, right? So for example, imagine this scenario where you built this bunch of user signals that you're trying to catch. Model repeating a question, user repeating a question, or model giving answers that are not grounded, or there's a hallucination metrics that catching all of this, right? Now, there are some offline metrics that you actually have. So your log filtering actually caught this list of conversations with the users, but then none of your metrics look off for these particular set of conversations. So what this means is like you have the right ability to flag that something went wrong in this list of conversations, but your metrics currently do not really tell you the story of like what actually went wrong. And this is the case where it validates having a user to go and take a look at these conversations and examine what are the failure patterns in this, right? And once you examine these failure patterns, now you can actually think of user signals or like building new user signals which can get this. For example, let's say you have your customer support application and you recently launched a new product, which might involve getting context from like an entirely different database to answer the user's question effectively. Now, you have the signals in place, which worked very well for your first product line. But as soon as the questions started trickling in for the second product line, your log filtering is flagging these logs, but then there is no comprehensive metric that is actually making you understand why something is wrong. So this is where you will go back and understand, okay, this is a new criteria or like a new category of signals that I need to build to be able to like get alerted for this. And this establishes a loop by which having your product out and letting it interact with customers in different use cases lets you build a stronger product. So that is the kind of flywheel that we are talking about in its emerging issue discovery category. So at a high level, building your monitoring strategy can be thought of in 4 different ways. One is always start simple and then evolve as you see more use cases. Do not come up with this extensive set of complex LLM judge metrics, even though you can afford the cost. You really need to validate that having these metrics in place is going to help you actually cache issues. It's not just about false negatives where you are missing some of the harmful interactions, but it's also the cost of false positives. As you have like more and more false positives in this log filtering because of your metrics, you are diverting the human's attention to actually spend that time either in product building or looking at actual valuable cases. So this is why it's recommended to start simple and then evolve as you go on. And then the criteria of like balancing cost and value. Going back to the metrics selection framework, make sure that you are having the right evaluation for these three pillars in mind so that you're able to make that decision easily. And the third one is also planning for scale. As your application is going to evolve and like gets used like millions of times, making sure that your metrics are okay to scale, or like using a smaller model or like a refined model to get this at a lower cost is extremely important. And the fourth part is closing the feedback loop. As your product is doing more interactions with the customers, making sure that you're learning from them and closing the loop by actually building new data sets or metrics that is going to actually make sure that the same kind of mistakes is not repeated in the future. These four are like very key categories to think about on how do you actually come up with a production monitoring strategy and use it later. So these are the key takeaways in this chapter. We talked about smart filtering, understanding how do you flag conversations. Sometimes it could be just pure business logic, and sometimes it could be explicit and implicit user signals. And once you have these things, can you identify what are the signals that I need to immediately squash as the user is interacting with the product? And that comes into the area of guardrails and flywheels. And the third one is about continuous discovery, where you have this cyclic loop that you are deployed or like the processes in place, so that as your application does more interactions, you have gained more knowledge about the domain, about the customers, and all about the shortcomings of your application, so that you're able to improve the quality of the product. And this is where the real improvements can be seen, and then clearly distinguishes your product from something that is like built very short-sightedly. So in the next chapter, we will be talking about the complete evaluation process, or the complete identity from going from what we thought about, like, the evaluation frameworks and offline data sets and things like that, to the production monitoring and how all of this ties together.